After the academy, I was assigned to a special purpose expedition. It was headed by I.S. Isakov, already familiar to the reader, who at that time was Chief of Staff of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet. In the early 30s, the international situation became very acute. In the East, a very aggressive policy was pursued by Japanese imperialism, which sought to dominate Asia. The most dangerous hotbed of war was formed in the West, when the Nazis seized power in Germany. The Soviet government was forced to take measures to further strengthen the defense of the country. Along with many other measures, in the spring of 1932 began the formation of the Far East Naval Forces, renamed in 1935 in the Pacific Fleet, and in 1933 was the beginning of the Northern Military Flotilla, for which a number of warships were transferred from the Baltic to the north. They marched along the White Sea-Baltic Canal, which had just become operational. The first detachment consisted of 2 destroyers, 2 patrol ships and 2 submarines. Transfer of naval warships along the system of rivers and lakes is not an easy thing. For this purpose, a special purpose expedition headed by an experienced Baltic sailor 3.A. Zakutnev was created. The chief of the expedition staff was I.S. Isakov. The way from Leningrad to Murmansk took then more than 2.5 months, from May 18th to August 5th. 3.A. Zakutnev stayed in the north. He was appointed to command the new flotilla, and Isakov, returning to Leningrad, began to form the second expedition, Eon II. I headed its headquarters. The new detachment included a destroyer, a patrol ship, a submarine and 2 minesweepers, hastily preparing them for the transition. To reduce the draft, remove from the ship's guns, torpedo tubes, batteries and other heavy things. All this will follow us on special barges. But the destroyer Karl Liebknecht, and after unloading, sat too deep. We had to drive it into a wooden dock and carry it in this huge box. Dismantling of ships took place in Kronstadt. The work was closely monitored by the fleet commander L.M. Galler, and perhaps even more closely the secretary of the Leningrad Regional Party Committee S.M. Kirov. Sergei Mironovich often visited the plant and the ships, talked with the sailors, with us, the leaders of the expedition, was interested in our needs and helped us in every possible way. In the future, he closely followed the course of the operation, made sure that tugboats were delivered on time and provided us with everything we needed. I remember that in Schlisselburg the rivermen said that they had no tugs available. Well, what to do? I said to the dispatcher of the shipping company. We'll have to report to Sergei Mironovich. That was enough. An hour later, the same dispatcher reported that the tugs had arrived at our disposal. In those years, there were no locks on the sphere, and this part of the 224-kilometre journey was the most difficult for us. It was especially hard to drag the destroyer in a clumsy wooden dock. The sphere was snake-like, the current was strong, but the worst of all were the rapids. There were a lot of them here then. Drag the heavy ships along the narrow and winding fairway among the stone ridges towards the turbulent current. If you don't watch out, you'll throw the ship onto the rocks. The dock and the destroyer were dragged along the sphere by 4 old wheeled tugs, and when we approached the long Medvedets rapids with 3 steep turns, 12 tugs were harnessed at once, and still we were hardly moving. It was scary to look down from the high board of the dock. The water was clear, and there were stones with sharp tops at the bottom. Sometimes at turns, in narrow places, the dock hit an angular stone block, and then big chips were torn off from its walls, as if from under a giant planer. We were standing with I.G. Karpov, the assistant head of the expedition, in the building and economic part, and we were shivering, looking at how chips were flying from us, in the full sense of the word. The tugboats, honking their horns, were desperately hitting the water with their pliers. Thick black smoke was billowing from the wide pipes, and the dock was crawling with the speed of a turtle. At last the old pilots brought us to ascension. Here we breathed a freer sigh. The destroyer got out of the log shell, and now could follow much faster on the account of 1 or 2 tugs. And in Onega Lake, wide and deep, the sailors felt themselves in their native element. Actually, the canal starts from Puvenitsa Place on the northern shore of Lake Onega. There is the famous Puvenitsa staircase, a whole cascade of locks. With their help, our ships, as on steps, climbed to the height of several tens of meters. And further 227 kilometers of the way along the rivers and lakes, connected into a single system. During a short stop, when all our caravan gathered in one place, the commissar of the expedition AP, Diakonov, said to me, "Yuri Alexandrovich, the sailors are interested in the history of the creation of the canal. Would you tell them about it?" I was interested in this issue in the academy. I read a lot of literature, so I agreed with pleasure. I told the sailors that the idea of the canal connecting the Baltic Sea with the White Sea was conceived under Peter the Great, but at that time there were not enough forces for its realization. At the end of the last and the beginning of our century, projects were drawn up, but the matter did not go any further. Only the Soviet power was able to carry out such construction. V.I. Lenin became interested in the problem of the canal. On his instructions, a special commission began to design the canal in the difficult year of 1919. The project was approved by the Council of Labour and Defence, and as soon as the country recovered from the Civil War, construction began. It went quickly, and by 1933 the work was finished. It was a great event in the life of our country. The sea route from Leningrad to the White Sea was reduced by 4,000 kilometres. The strategic importance of the canal was great. Now ships from the Baltic to the north could go through our inland waterways. This road is still not easy, but it is much shorter, and most importantly, out of reach for the eyes of our enemies. Here is Belomorsk. Here we waited for barges with property. With the help of workers who arrived from Leningrad, put the ships in order and went to the White Sea. Autumn in the north is quiet and pleasant. The mountains are still brown-green. Not hot sun shines brightly. At the roadstead of Soskovets Island we were solemnly welcomed by the ships of the young Northern Military Flotilla. Warmly welcomed us Commander 3.A. Zakutnev and a member of the Military Council PP. Bayrochny. The Barents Sea was gloomy. The ships were surrounded by thick fog. In order not to collide with each other, they kept echoing sirens. But with sunrise the fog began to thin, and we entered Murmansk with clear sky. The flotilla was given a long pier in the commercial port. The base of the submarines was a small steamer Umber, which hardly accommodated the crews of 3 boats. The military council, headquarters and political department of the flotilla were on the training ship Komsomolets, which passed with cadets from Kronstadt to Murmansk around Scandinavia. It provided communication with ships at sea. But the main base of the flotilla in Ekaterinskaya harbour was already under construction. Ion 2 was completed. Isakov left for Kronstadt, and I unexpectedly received a new appointment ordered to take the cases of the Chief of Staff of the flotilla. The staff mainly consisted of my Baltic peers. We lived amicably. We were fascinated by the work on the development of a new sea theatre, its uninhabited bays and islands. This enthusiasm was skillfully supported and directed by our party organisation headed by the Secretary S.A. Sadov. The government demanded to choose places for basing ships, to install coastal batteries and observation and communication posts, which had not been here before. Our staff family worked very actively and industriously. Our hydrographers and their chief energetic, competent sailor B.I. Shamsha worked hard. The beacons worked without fail. Hydrographers searched the whole coast, making detailed maps. I remember on the patrol ship Groza we went around bays, straits, islands. The naval officers erected observation towers at selected points, and in the meantime they deployed their temporary posts on lighthouses, or even on the roofs of fishermen's houses. Soon the main base of the flotilla had its eyes and ears all along the coast, in what was a great merit of our communicator B.N. Shatrov. And in time, foreign intelligence became intensely interested in the Soviet North. Most often these spies disguised themselves as fishermen and fur trappers. One day the duty officer on the headquarters reported to me a mile from Cape Tsip-Navalok a foreign trawler was fishing in our waters. The maritime border service here was still weak. There were no ships nearby. I ordered to prepare a destroyer on duty. We rushed at full speed to Tsip-Navalok. Indeed, we see the trawler is dragging a net behind itself, slowly creeping almost close to the shore. Fishermen were amazed to see a Soviet destroyer. They could not understand where we came from. They had nowhere to go. They had to wait for the border boat we called. The detained vessel was taken to our port, and its crew was taken care of by the relevant authorities. Most often during such incidents, the patrol ship Groza was sent to the sea. It was commanded by A.E. Pastukov, a young and ardent sailor in love with the sea and his ship. I knew him as a cadet. He was always characterized by vigor, and at the same time neatness and tautness. Apparently, Alexander Evgenievich was able to instill all this in his crew. It was friendly, tireless, the ship was always clean. This crew could accomplish any task. I have already said that we on the Groza went around the entire coast, choosing bays for future bases, positions for batteries. We climbed a lot of mountains and gorges with different commissions. Most often we were accompanied by an old naval artilleryman, a veteran of coastal defense IA. Kasatkin. Already an elderly hero of the Civil War, he remained alive and agile, and it was not easy for us, young people, to keep up with him. I remember, near the tiny village of Vayenga, where Severomorsk city grew up afterwards, we were wading through dense thickets of some plants taller than a man. Kasatkin stroked his lush red moustache and squinted thoughtfully. This is how Gaoliang grows in the steppes of Manchuria. And at that time we had no time for botany. There was no escape from the midges. They were eating us up, stuffing our noses and mouths. But our shoreman did nothing, walking briskly, pushing the thickets apart with his hands. Our flagship miner Vasily Ivanovich Platonov was gloomily inspecting the bays and coves. There were very deep waters everywhere. According to the rules of the time, we could not make torpedo firing here, because if a torpedo sinks and lies on the ground, our divers will not be able to lift it. But in the end, Platonov solved this problem. For torpedo firing chose shallow areas of the White Sea. VI. Platonov already then showed himself an inquisitive and determined man. These qualities he fully demonstrated during the war years. VI. Platonov became an admiral and at one time headed the Northern Fleet. The climate of the north is harsh. It is not easy to get used to it. We feared that some of the sailors would not survive, but these gloomy forecasts did not come true. Neither bad drinking water at first, nor the sun shining round the clock in summer, nor the long and gloomy polar night overpowered our people. In many respects we owe it to the medics, headed by Dr. A.V. Edel Smolnikov, in the future a general. He not only treated but took all measures to prevent diseases, conducted great preventive work. Until the polar night came, we let the Komsomolets go back to the Baltic. The headquarters and political department were relocated to Polonnoy, to the wooden premises of the Museum of Pinro. The director of the institute, Prof. Kluge, with our help, moved all his household to Murmansk, and on the tower of the museum created by him worked observation and communication post of the flotilla headquarters. In the far north, in the land of unintimidated birds, Soviet people hastily created bases, coastal batteries, observation posts. The young Northern military flotilla was gaining strength. It soon turned into the mighty Northern Fleet, which during the Great Patriotic War covered itself with unfading glory. The life of a sailor is restless. In a few years I had a chance to visit many seas. In 1939 I found myself in the Pacific Ocean as the chairman of the State Commission that accepted submarines from the industry. I had to sail a lot and for a long time enter bays and gulfs, and I was more and more attracted to these places, the ocean expanse. I did not suspect that 12 years would pass and I would come here to command the fleet. In the meantime, I was engaged in the troublesome business of accepting ships. Accepted ships were handed over to the Pacific Fleet. It was then commanded by my old acquaintance Ivan Stepanovich Yumashev. "Listen, brother," he once said to me, "your current service is not for you. After all, you're used to command. Do you want to join me as commander of the trawling and barrage brigade?" Of course, I agreed without a second thought. We sent an application to Moscow, but nothing came out. In response came a telegram: Panteliev urgently returned to Moscow at the disposal of the People's Commissar. At that time, there was no regular air service on this line. We travelled by Blue Express, which covered the distance from Vladivostok to Moscow in 10 days, not counting the inevitable delays. The People's Commissariat of the Navy was located in a new modern house with a high tower. I was surprised that instead of anchors or any other naval attributes, the building had a bas-relief of a tank. It turned out that the building was built for the tank troops department. The Navy turned out to be a cuckoo that crawled into someone else's nest, from which it was soon evicted. In the reception room of the People's Commissar was crowded. Concerned people with puffy briefcases waited for the reception, hid behind padded doors, and soon appeared again even more anxious. Our Navy Commissariat was in its second year of existence, and at its head had already been several leaders accidental, and less accidental, but none of them left behind a noticeable trace. The exception was the flagman of the fleet's second rank, Nikolai Gerasimovich Kuznetsov, familiar to me from the Chervona, Ukraine. He was on the spot thinking, confident, perfectly knowing the fleet and its people. Kuznetsov received me standing, leaning slightly with his hands on the back of the chair. Afterwards I learned that this was his manner. He did not like to be lingering, he liked to solve everything quickly. Nodding to me, the commissar came to the table where there were telephones. All the phones were black in colour, except for one white. It was the one from which the People's Commissar picked up the receiver. "I have Pantalayev," he said. "That's right. Permission to send him?" "Yes." And the white tube went back to its place. The Commissar smiled and extended his hand to me. "Congratulations. Comrade Stalin has agreed with us. You're appointed Chief of Staff of the Baltic Fleet." It was said in such a tone, as if I was already informed about everything and I have no doubts, and cannot arise. Nikolai Gerasimovich went to the corner of the office, to the table where the map was laid out, and called me over. "Look here." He drew the end of the pencil along our border with Finland on the Kaelian Isthmus. "This is only 32 kilometers from Leningrad. Can you imagine? And our northern neighbour has been very unfriendly to us lately. The reactionaries of the West are pitting them against us. In such conditions, anything can happen. You must hurry to Kronstadt." The Commissar shook my hand and wished me success. On a quiet, clear autumn day, when the sea ripples and the air seems motionless, I saw a familiar panorama of my native Kotlin. The ensemble of ancient buildings crowned with the dome of the cathedral looked like a bird spreading its wide wings. Kronstadt. Once from its harbours sailing ships of the famous Russian navigators Bellingshausen and Krusenstern left for distant voyages. In this city in the spring of 1917 the Soviets won, which from the very first days did not recognize the bourgeois provisional government. In October, Kronstadt sailors at the call of Lenin were the first to come to Petrograd and took part in the armed uprising. In the harbours and on the raids of Kronstadt was born the Red Navy. From here came the first Soviet flagships. For many of us, Kronstadt became a school of courage and political maturity, and we sailors have forever loved it. Fleet Commander, Flagman Second Rank Vladimir Tributes met me in his beautiful dark blue office, furnished with antique furniture. We knew each other back at the Academy VF. Tributes was a year older than me at graduation. He had changed very little. Tall, thin, with sharp movements. Our conversation was short. "Take your cases and quickly get into the situation. We'll talk later." But we did not soon find time for a detailed conversation. Events were growing like a snowball. Plunged into work, I felt like a man catching up with a passenger train. You run, but you can't grab the rail of at least the last carriage. It was good that I was surrounded by reliable comrades, with many of whom I was connected by joint service in the Navy in my younger years. They helped me to get up to speed quickly. Still, I managed to jump into the last car of the train when its wheels were already pounding at full speed. The news came alarming. On October 11th, negotiations with the Finns began, but they led to nothing and were broken off 2 days later. Finland announced mobilization of reserve troops. The head of the intelligence department of the fleet headquarters reported the Finns began evacuation of the population from the Kaelian Isthmus. The border pillars fell down the Finnish fleet mines the bay. The headquarters of the Leningrad military district warned the Finns are deploying their armies on our border. On November 28th, commander of the district, commander of the second rank KA, Meretskov called me and the commander of the fleet, familiarized us with the situation. Be ready for everything. The Military Council of the fleet urgently gathered all flag officers and demanded to increase combat readiness. Commissar of the Staff Regimental Commissar and Sidorov at the party meeting explained to the communists the complexity of the political situation and called for even clearer work. Meetings were held on all ships and parts of the fleet. The mood everywhere is combative, and as always happens in difficult moments, sharply increased the flow of applications for admission to the party and Komsomol. Sailors wrote that they wanted to go to battle as communists. On November 30th, fighting began on the border. Our submarines and surface ship sentries took positions. Reconnaissance planes took to the air. In the morning we, with a group of officers of the headquarters, hurried to the signal tower. On the Finnish coast sparkled flashes of gunfire. The enemy artillery hit our troops. Then the northern forts of Kronstadt and the mighty guns of Krasnaya Gorka gave their voice. The rumble of cannonade was growing. Our serious combat examination began. I went down to the flagship command post. In a large ancient hall at the tables sit staff commanders. Each is responsible for a particular area for submarines, aviation, surface ships. In the center of the hall is a large table with a huge map. It is applied to the general situation. The hall is the same in which we worked in peacetime, unprotected, with ceilings that can be penetrated by any shell, let alone an airplane bomb. It took bitter experience for us to learn how to securely hide our command posts. From the shore comes a report. The infantry thanked for the accurate fire. The fighting developed heavily. December 3rd, parts of the 70th Infantry Division stopped in front of the fortifications of the old Fort Eno. The infantrymen again asked us to help. The fleet commander sent a division of gunboats under the command of Captain 3rd Rank EI. Lazo to support the army men. From a distance of 20 cable meters, ships opened fire. But there were no adjusters on the shore. They fired on the area, so the effectiveness of fire was low. We had to urgently organize a shore mobile corrective post. Fire cannon boats immediately became more accurate. The army men were able to move forward again. That year there was a rare, fierce winter. The frost reached 40 degrees. Already in early December, the sea began to freeze. Ships could be taken out only with the help of icebreakers. It was ordered to take Lavesh-Ari, Seskar, Gogland and a number of other islands in the Gulf of Finland. We gave the pilots the task to treat these islands reliably. A lot of bombs were dropped. Coastal batteries of Luga Bay sent hundreds of heavy shells to the area. In the evening called on the phone Chief of Staff of the Fleet Aviation Colonel Pavel Pavlovich Kady. You can land paratroopers. The pilots ploughed the islands to the best of their ability. Do you have any losses? No, all the planes came back. Were the Finns there? There's a lot of anti-aircraft artillery on the islands. Some planes had holes in their wings and fuselage. Could it be from their own shrapnel? It shouldn't be. I had to think about it. The thing is that a few days ago we sent our scouts to Gogland to Komsomol Finns. They searched the island up and down and reported that there was not a soul there. They did not believe the guys and decided to act according to the original plan. They sent warships to the island. They opened hurricane fire on the coastal strip in the landing sites. The enemy didn't respond. I stood on the bridge of the ship, watching the landing of 1,500 fighters, and it seemed to me that I could see through binoculars and fire points and enemy soldiers. In fact, the island was empty. It remained to regret that we did not believe the reconnaissance fighters and wasted so much effort and munition. Maybe the pilots bombed in vain too. Alas, in a combat situation there are often all sorts of inconsistencies. I remember how the destroyer reported to us about the detection of an enemy aircraft, although it turned out afterwards that it was a Soviet plane. And the pilots, in turn, broadcast that they saw an enemy destroyer. To understand these reports was not easy. To win, you must first of all be able to recognize the enemy and know as much as possible about him. And for this you need experience and more experience. Actually, the rapid occupation of all the islands in the eastern part of the Gulf of Finland was of great importance for us. It created an operational depth of sea defense approaches to Kronstadt, and therefore to Leningrad. And finally, it was a reliable cover of the seaside flank of our 7th Army. According to the plan, the troops were to advance along the coast, but since their coastal flank could be hindered by Finnish coastal batteries standing on the islands, it was necessary to suppress these firepower. Unfortunately, we did not know the exact location of the batteries. Therefore, the fleet commander ordered me to conduct a reconnaissance by combat Kilpisari Island, covering the entrance to the port of Kotka. On December 6th, a detachment of ships consisting of the leader Minsk, 2 old destroyers and several boats left Kronstadt under the flag of the Chief of Staff of the fleet. We quickly reached the edge of the Espinski Icebergs. The rangefinder reports. Distance 70 cable meters. The island is silent. 60 cable meters. Still silence. Maybe this island is empty too. There is almost no wind, it is cool, but we on the bridge are hot from tents waiting. 50 cable meters. The red ship signalman reports. I see a flash. The battery has opened fire. Finally. Sighed a sigh of relief from one of the staff commanders. Order to open fire. The leader shuddered at the friendly volley. Hit the guns and other ships. But the enemy continues to fire. A column of water rushed up in front of the leader's bow. We do not stop firing. 3 enemy shells exploded very close. Shrapnel knocked on the side of the ship, the war room, the smokestack. 1 splinter, apparently already in the air, dug into the fur collar of my winter raglan. It smelled of burning. I shook the fragment on the deck, and when it cooled down, I picked it up and kept it as a memory of my first sea battle. Navigators hastily take bearing on the flash's record distances. We continue to follow the combat course and fire. Shells from the shore fell with a small flight, so we're in the fork. The caliber of enemy shells minus 152 millimeters. If they hit us, they'll do us a lot of harm. I'm signaling the commander of the ship. Machine telegraphs rang. The ship increased its speed. The sea hunters are putting up a smoke screen to hide the squad from enemy eyes. Behind the clouds of smoke can still be heard the rumble of explosions. We have accomplished the task. We have established the exact location of the enemy battery. On the enemy batteries on different islands in December fired cruiser Kirov, destroyers and even line ships. But the firing was often conducted without correction, and its results in such cases were unimportant. Afterwards, I and a group of commanders of the headquarters had a chance to visit the islands of Russa and Bjork, which were fired at by large ships. The batteries there suffered little damage, and this was also the case on other islands. Our naval artillerymen at that time were not sufficiently trained in firing at coastal targets. They had been preparing for years for battles only with the sea enemy. This was a clear omission. We worked out a detailed plan for landing a large landing force on the islands of the Bjarki archipelago. We should have started as soon as the 7th Army broke through the main strip of enemy defences. But on December 23rd, our land forces stopped advancing. There were not enough forces to overcome the Mannerheim line. And winter was not waiting. The sea was quickly covered with an ice shell. On December 30th, breaking through with icebreakers, warships went to sea for the last time to support the flank of the army with artillery. The landing had to be cancelled. The Finnish fleet did not show itself at sea. The enemy surface ships stood in their bases under the cover of coastal batteries. Finnish aviation operated only at the front. Nevertheless, the Finns managed to place mine barriers at Cape Juminda and at the entrance to Paldiski. This violated the sovereignty of Estonia, then still a bourgeois republic, but I think it was done not without the knowledge of Estonian rulers. The main attention of the White Finnish command was paid to the South Kvarken Strait. Through it there was a way to the Gulf of Bothnia, through which aid from the west was delivered from Sweden to the ports of Finland. In the strait, the Finns put up a powerful mine barrier, which they officially announced on December 6th, but our submarines successfully overcame this dangerous boundary. It is always hard to sail in December. Storms, snow charges, impenetrable fogs, frost causing icing of the ship. From the submariners required great effort to act in such an environment. And yet on December 10th, the submarine Shesh 322 under the command of Lieutenant Commander VA. Polshchuk sank the first enemy transport with military cargo. The breakthrough to the Gulf of Bothnia every day became more and more difficult and dangerous. I have repeatedly talked to the commanders of the boats. It is possible to force the strait at the cost of extreme tension of forces and nerves. You have to go under mines are rattling against the side of the boat. And deviate to the side, hit the rocks, told me the commander of the division, Lieutenant Captain A. Oral. The bottom of the strait is very uneven. In some places there are huge boulders, and even underwater rocks. We have no detailed maps of the strait, but we have to go almost close to the islets. And there are lighthouses with observation posts on them. Only the most skillful and brave commanders could force Kvarken and act in Botnik. Perhaps the greatest success fell to the share of F.G. Vershinin. During one campaign he sank 3 enemy transports. His ship was assigned a difficult position in the northern part of the Gulf of Bothnia, near the port of Vausa, where the ice stretched for a dozen miles from the shore. Seeing the transport, the division commander Oral ordered to pursue the enemy over the water. Ice floes were scraping against the side. They could damage the hull and propellers, but the submariners did not slow down. The transport was caught up at night. They opened fire from cannons. Artillerymen coped with the task. The transport went up in flames, and then disappeared among ice floes. 4 hours later, in the darkness, found the second enemy ship. It was sunk quickly. With the third ship approached in thick fog. It was very difficult to shoot. The target was hardly distinguishable. Still we sent the enemy to the bottom. The ship was carrying a cargo of liquid fuel. In a short period of time in the Gulf of Bothnia visited 8 of our submarines. One of the first to overcome the anti-submarine frontier in Kvarken was submarines S-1 Captain Lieutenant A.V. Tripolsky and Sh 319 Captain Lieutenant N.S. Egashin. They blocked the ports of Raumo and Kristina until almost the whole bay was covered with ice. The last to leave the Gulf of Bothnia on January 19th was Captain 3rd Rank A.M. Konyev. I remember well how much we had to endure then. In Kvarken Strait S-1 was forced to surface, and immediately it was pinned by ice. When we received the news of this, we began to think feverishly about how to help her. Someone even suggested asking Sweden to send its icebreakers. But that would have meant losing the ship. It would have been interned with the crew. And from the boat came radiograms, one after another, more alarming. The Soviet ship was attacked by enemy planes. Fortunately, the bombs fell aside. Submariners managed to hit one plane, and the enemy refused to attack again. Meanwhile, nature itself helped our comrades. The ice cracked, moved, and S-1 jumped out of its clinging embrace. But before we could rejoice, as we received a report from Captain 3rd Rank A.M. Konyaev Sh 324 was also squeezed by ice. Konyaev did not ask for help, so he hoped for his own strength. I had known this tall, thin man with thoughtful eyes for a long time. Calm, judicious, he found a brilliant and the only right way out. Knowing that the Baltic Sea was ahead, which could not freeze yet, he plunged and went under the ice, now and then hitting the mine's steel cables that hold the mine at a given depth. More than 30 miles Sh 324 blindly broke under the ice and then safely surfaced. It was the world's first submarine subglacial voyage. When Konyev reported that he had broken out of ice captivity, there was no limit to the joy on the BFCP. All the boats had returned safely to their bases. It was a great good fortune. Submarine commanders A.M. Konyev, F.G., Vershinin and A.V. Tripolsky were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for this feat. Their boats became the first red banner ships of the fleet. The crews were generously awarded. The crew of the boat Sh 311 owed their victories to the courage and perseverance of the commander A.E.E. Eagle. I looked closely at him, a knowledgeable, energetic commander, whose word was never at odds with deed. He deservedly received a high government award. Later A.E. Oral headed the submarine forces in the north, and then in the rank of admiral commanded the Baltic fleet. Uninterruptedly, and in the fall and winter, operated our naval aviation. In the evenings, when the planes returned to the airfields, the Chief of Staff of Aviation PP, Kavade, called me on the phone and briefly reported on the events of the day. Usually his report sounded short. Mission accomplished. This meant that our bombers successfully bombed the batteries or naval base of the enemy, supported the fire of their advancing infantry or sunk enemy ships. In short, aviation acted perfectly. Often PP. Cavade came to our headquarters with maps and aerial photographs. Once he reported in detail how our aviation near the ports of Turku, Roma and Pori put mines on the fairways. Here the communications, through which the enemy received help from the west, converged. It should be said that such a mine-laying was done by aviation for the first time in the world. "Well, Pavel Pavlovich," I said, "thank you for your new contribution to naval art. But how are the Finnish ships doing?" Pilots long hunted for battleships Coastal Defence Väinämöinen and Ilmarinen, which could counter the advance of the coastal flank of our army. But these ships were perfectly camouflaged and were hiding somewhere in the skerries west of Hanko. They were reliably covered by anti-aircraft batteries and fighter aviation. To all this, the ships, with the help of icebreakers, often changed their places. Pilots searched for battleships, fought heavy air battles, but the ships escaped from the strike. In the search for battleships included, and our submarines. Once we received information that the battleships were hiding behind one of the islands, but so well camouflaged that they could not be detected from the air. We decided to send submariners there. We knew the fairway was mined, we could not pass through it. There was only one way directly between the small islands. Only the little one could pass there. It was a dangerous undertaking. We had no detailed maps of this scary area, and there were banks and sharp underwater rocks sugarheads everywhere. We called the commander of M90 Senior Lieutenant P.A. Sidorenko and explained him the task. "Well, can you cope?" I asked the young commander. Sidorenko looked closely at the map and reconnaissance documents. After thinking, answered, "It will be done." And he kept his word. Sneaked through the narrow winding straits, examined the roadstead of interest to us, reported on the radio that there are no ships here, but on the shore found an artillery battery and a number of other important objects. I talked to Sidorenko when he returned. "It was difficult," said the senior lieutenant. "In some places we lost depth, flew as if into a pit, then slowly crawled on our bellies across the bottom, bumping into rocks. But we got there without any damage. We examined everything discreetly. And the way back seemed easier." The young commander showed exceptional endurance and skill in controlling the ship. If the propeller or rudder had broken, the boat would have perished. We would not have been able to help her in the skerries. P.A. Sidorenko is still alive and well. He is captain of the first rank. He serves in the Naval Academy. In winter, our pilots had a hard time. Snowfalls and blizzards put airfields out of operation. Snow removal equipment got stuck. Everyone had to take up shovels. As long as you clear the runway, the short winter day begins to draw to a close. And the air was no sweeter. The thick, low clouds would not dissipate. Will come to us, sometimes the Fleet Aviation Commander Kombrig VV. Ermochenkov rubs his chilled hands. What a frost. Under 40. You, I see, are completely frozen in the ice. You don't swim, you don't shoot. But great masters of setting tasks for others fly, say, find and bomb. And why are your battleships silent? In the fall they sailed and sailed, but they forgot to put the mines. Again, our pilots had to correct the matter to throw mines from the air. That's Ermochenkov's specialty. He believes that everything rests on aviation, and they allegedly pay insufficient attention to it. We, with the Commissar of the Staff Sidorov and the head of the operational department Pilipovsky, listened to good-natured attacks Ermochenkov. Actually, he is right in many respects. Air forces were becoming increasingly important, and we have not always taken this into account. Meanwhile, for a few months of fighting, Baltic naval pilots sank or disabled 37 transports, shot down 65 enemy aircraft, much more than all our ships. And what feats were performed by winged heroes. Alexei Gubry, a 22-year-old pilot, will always remain in my memory. He made dozens of combat sorties. One of them went down in history. On February 2nd, 1940, on a frosty, blizzardy day, Gubry, returning from a mission, heard on the radio that Lieutenant Pinchok's plane was hit and landed on ice near the enemy shore. Gubry immediately rushed to the rescue. In a blizzard, when 100 meters to see nothing, he ran over the snowy plain and still found, landed, took his friends and took off in front of the enemy. Remembering this episode, I asked my colleague, also a participant of the Finnish War, twice hero of the Soviet Union VI. Rakov, now a General of Aviation, Doctor of Naval Sciences and Professor at the Naval Academy. Vasily Ivanovich, didn't I get something wrong with Gubry? No, everything is correct. By the way, it wasn't just Gubry who did this. Senior Lieutenant Anatoly Nefedov saved 3 wounded pilots. Senior Lieutenant Fyodor Radus also landed in a frost and blizzard near our plane, took all its crew, weapons, documents and returned home safely. AAA. Gubry, II, Nefedov and FN. Radus became heroes of the Soviet Union. This high title was earned then by 14 more Baltic pilots. In those days began, and the glory of Captain Vasily Ivanovich Rakov, whose talent was fully developed during the Great Patriotic War, when he made hundreds of combat sorties, sank more than 15 ships, destroyed dozens of enemy aircraft. The Gulf of Finland is finally covered with ice. Now, there was a danger that enemy troops could pass through it to our rear. The headquarters of the Leningrad front reasoned as follows: since the ice is the same water, it means that sailors should fight on it. For actions on the ice line of 80 kilometers between the Gulf of Vyborg and the island of Gogland, we urgently formed a rifle brigade and 5 separate battalions from sailors. 3 heavy railroad batteries maneuvered along the shore. Leningrad sportsmen sailors took an active part in the fighting. They made up the crews of buoys, which carried out reconnaissance and communication service on the ice of the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga. Many captains of the buoys distinguished themselves, in particular MF Antonov, who kept communication between the southern shore of the Luga Bay area and the northern shore near Cape Sivast, IV Kurishev IP, Matveyev BS, Yakovlev MF Igorov. In the fresh wind, the ice yachts carried at a speed of up to 100 kilometers per hour and were elusive for the enemy. The formation of the brigade and separate rifle battalions was engaged in the fleet headquarters, its organizational department, headed by Colonel Azilian. The matter was completely unexpected for us and was not part of any plans. Fighters were recruited from coastal defense units and volunteers from ships. There were a lot of willing men, which testified to the high morale of sailors. This was the result of well-organized political work in the fleet, which was led by Brigade Commissar P.I. Belsky. It was not easy for the head of the rear M.I. Moskalenko. It was necessary to provide soldiers with weapons, warm winter clothing, find several thousand pairs of skis with bindings. To be honest, we did not do much skiing in the Navy, and the sailors did not know how to ski well. We had to urgently organize training. We paid special attention to a special shore escort detachment of 1,500 people. It consisted of volunteers from the ships. It was formed in Oranienbaum. The commander of the detachment was Kombrig N.Y. Denisovich. The commissar was a young at that time battalion commissar V.M. Grishanov. Although there was a significant difference in years between them, but both true communists immediately found a common language. Denisovich, a sturdily bunched mustachioed man, was both in appearance and in character a successful Cossack. Pushy, well-versed in business, he firmly held the detachment in his hands, skillfully built training. V.M. Grishanov, also tireless and persistent, showed himself a good educator and cared a lot about his soldiers. We and the Commissar of the Staff and Sidorov more than once visited the detachment and saw that the party organization and Komsomol managed to firmly unite people who came from the most diverse parts and ships of the fleet. All of them were brave, tall, healthy guys dreaming of a feat. We used to come to the barracks and ask, "Well, guys, how are you doing? What do you need?" They answered that they were satisfied with everything. They were interested in one thing when they would be sent to the front, and no requests. But when we talked to the commander of the detachment N.Y., Denisovich and Commissar V.M. Grishanov, we were flooded with requests for spare sets of skis, guns, and even tanks. We did not have enough notebooks to write everything down, but we tried to do what we could. We knew that these people would not ask anything for nothing. The detachment was to cover the seaside flank of the 7th Army, and during the offensive of our troops to assist the 70th Infantry Division in its movement along the coast. By the end of January, the detachment was transferred to the coast, in the area of Cape Sivast. Our troops were preparing to break through the main strip of enemy defences. Sailors' skiers deeply penetrated into the enemy location, revealing resistance nodes. On February 4th, a group of scouts was ambushed. Squad Commander Morozov was wounded. The enemy officer tried to strangle him. But Krasnoflotets Poskonkin, a 20-year-old big man from the Tambov region, came up. He stabbed the officer with a bayonet, threw grenades at the soldier, and weighing Morozov on himself, carried him out of the fire. This is how Russian Bogotars acted, and there were many of them in the detachment. A.R. Poskonkin was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. On the way of the detachment stood a powerful Fort Murila. 4 days sailors stormed it and still took it, having written in the history of our fleet one more glorious page. After a very thorough preparation and accumulation of forces on February 11th, 1940 began a victorious offensive of our troops. They broke through the Mannerheim Line. The Soviet government once again offered to conclude peace, but the negotiations were again dragging, tedious, because at that time the head of Finnish reaction Tanner travelled around the Western European capitals, begging to start a general campaign against the Soviet Union. When our troops approached Vyborg, naval rifle battalions under the command of Captains B.M. Granin and V.V., Sorokin went out at night to all occupied by the Soviet Union. Sorokin at night left all the islands occupied by us and headed for the mainland. Having overcome dozens of kilometres on ice, at dawn on March 4th they started fighting in the enemy's rear from Kotka to the Vyborg Bay, which forced the enemy to pull back reserves from the front, including air units. This was a great help for our army. On March 13th, 1940, the Soviet government signed a peace treaty with Finland. Our troops and navy eliminated a dangerous bridgehead, the border on the Kayin Isthmus, which passed at a distance of a cannon shot from Leningrad, was pushed back 150 kilometres. These battles were a serious test, which largely prepared us for the severe trials of the Great Patriotic War. With increasing anxiety, we followed the events in the West. The Second World War was already raging there. Fascist Germany captured Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway. Hitler's diplomats and generals visited the bourgeois republics of the Baltic states and Finland. Our people could not be indifferent to this. The party and the government took measures to strengthen the defence capacity of the country. Stocks of strategic raw materials were created. In the eastern regions of the country, remote from the western borders, there were factories that produced military products. All branches of the armed forces were developing. Our navy was also getting stronger. And we in the Baltic received from industry dozens of destroyers, modern submarines, 2 beautiful light cruisers, torpedo boats. Long-range and high-speed guns were equipped with our coastal defence. The terms of service in the navy were slightly increased. The Communist Party and the Soviet government, caring for the security of our western borders, concluded agreements on mutual assistance with the Baltic states. Our fleet was given the opportunity to be based in their ports, to create a system of defence of the coast and islands. Henceforth, the entrance to the Gulf of Finland was reliably blocked by the multi-layer fire of our powerful coastal batteries on the islands of Dago, Odensholm, on the peninsula of Hanko, leased to us by Finland. The sea route to Leningrad was now under reliable control. In the same year, 1940, the peoples of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia overthrew the bourgeois governments and joined the Soviet Union. This further strengthened our strategic position in the Baltic. The further depended on whether we would have time to quickly master the new theatre. After all, the length of our maritime border in the Baltic reached 1,740 kilometres. June 20th, the Military Council, headquarters and other institutions of the fleet moved to Tallinn. Urgently equipped bases in Riga, Libava, airfields, coastal defence batteries. We had to hurry. The headquarters of the Leningrad military district informed us about the incessant concentration of German troops on our land borders. Fascist airplanes invaded our airspace more and more often. Unknown submarines began to appear near the coast. A squadron of large German warships demonstratively conducted manoeuvres in full view of our coast. It became known that the Nazis transferred to Finland about 43,000 of their soldiers. We, the staff, understood that this is not for nothing and tried to maximize the combat effectiveness of the fleet. We organized drills. Sudden drills checked the combat readiness of units and formations. Work in the headquarters was not interrupted from morning until late at night. The soul of the staff team was the party organization. My deputy in the political part of the regimental commissar and Sidorov worked skillfully, proactively. Combatively, purposefully led all party political work in the Fleet Chief Pubolta Brigade Commissar P.I. Belsky. All sailors knew him well. Staff and Pubolt worked very friendly, and it was of great importance for further improvement of combat readiness of the fleet. The word war was not yet officially pronounced anywhere, but we felt it was close. Just in case the ships were dispersed. Already at the end of May 1941 we transferred cruisers, destroyers and most of the submarines from Libava to Riga, where there were more air defence facilities. The battleship Marat and the minesweeper OK were transferred from Tallinn to Kronstadt. At midnight Tallinn was plunged into darkness, and only in the windows of a large building, where the headquarters and political department of the fleet did not go out the light. The fleet by that time had experienced leadership staff. Squadron commanded by a brave and energetic Rear Admiral D.D. Vidovichenko, a detachment of Light Forces Rear Admiral V.P. Drozd. The submarine brigades were headed by the participant of the war in Spain, hero of the Soviet Union, Captain First Rank N.P., Egyptko and excellent submariners Captain First Rank N.I., Vinogradov and Captain Second Rank A.E. Oral. Brigades of torpedo boats were commanded by Captains Second Rank V.S., Cherokov and V.A., Solomatin, who were in love with their work, with their swift small ships. Large specialists stood at the head of Coastal Defense Generals I.S., Mushnov and I.N. Dmitriev, Colonels I.A., Kustov and V.T., Rumiantsev. The Air Force was headed by Major General V.V. Ermachenkov. Here grew up outstanding pilots, heroes of the Soviet Union N. Preobrazhensky, V.I. Rakov, I.I. Borzov, I.G. Romanenko, I.I. Krokalev. Unfortunately, we had few modern aircraft. A particular shortage was felt in fighters. We had quite accurate information about the forces of our probable enemy in the Baltic. We could expect the appearance in our waters one modern battleship, 4 cruisers, more than 36 destroyers, up to 80 submarines, a large number of torpedo boats and minesweepers. To this, there were reasons to add 71 warships of the Finnish fleet. The forces are not insignificant. At the beginning of summer we received alarming signals from our border guards. This prompted us to put the fleet on high alert as early as June 19, 1941. Commanders of formations moved to their command posts. Discharge of personnel to shore was stopped. Ships took on board all the necessary combat supplies. Party meetings were held. They discussed the situation. Communists called on all sailors to increase vigilance and be ready for battle. Long before that, at our request, the Chief Naval Headquarters had authorized to set up ships patrols in the mouth of the Gulf of Finland, in the Urbensky Strait, and on the approaches to all our naval bases. Up to the time they did not detect anything suspicious in the sea. June 20th and 21 were also quiet. The only alarming thing was that the number of German merchant ships in the sea had decreased, and they were now travelling with a combat guard. It was also worrying that under various formal pretexts the Germans began to detain our ships in German ports. At 23 hours 37 minutes on June 21st received a dispatch from Moscow. People's Commissar of the Navy Admiral N.G. Kuznetsov ordered to move all fleets to the highest operational readiness number 1. Urgent signal to formations and units. Their commanders knew what to do. The necessary documents were stored in safes. It remained only to open the sealed packages. But there was very little time left. At dawn, the commander of our base in Libava, Captain First Rank MS. Klavensky, reported the bombs fell on the military camp and in the airfield area. There is no special damage, and immediately another alarm call Chief of Staff of the Kronstadt base Captain Second Rank FV, Zozulia reported. Dropped 16 German mines at the entrance to the Kronstadt raid. The waterway remained clear. And it went. Telephones ringing incessantly. Reports of silhouettes of unknown ships, submarine periscopes, airborne landings. Not a stream, but a waterfall of reports. and all of them must be taken, analysed, sift out the credible from the obvious nonsense. And as soon as possible, because every second of delay threatens to result in the loss of hundreds and thousands of human lives. A long, vaulted room without windows, a concrete casemate of a coastal battery from the times of the First World War. Along the walls are tables of operators. Each has his own telephone. In the middle is a large table with a map of the situation. The operator listens to the next report on the phone, quickly makes notes on the map, and the phone is already blowing up again. Calls, muffled murmur of dozens of voices, brightly illuminated map of the Baltic Sea, covered with more and more conditional icons. This is our BFCP, the Coastal Flagship Command Post of the Fleet. 4 hours and 50 minutes. The heavy steel door of the sweat room swings open. Fleet Commander Vice Admiral VF. Tributes crosses the high threshold, comes to the map, frowning, tired eyes run through it, then turns to my desk. He takes his favourite large pencil in his hands. I hand him a prepared telegram. Conflot silently reads it, signs it, and then rereads it aloud. Germany has launched an attack on our bases and ports. Repel the enemy by force of arms. Conflot returns the form to me. I give it to our communicator Kashin, and he disappears in the hole. In a second, wires and airwaves carried to Hanko and Riga, to Zell Island and Kronstadt, to formations, units and ships these first words about the beginning of the war. Strange thing is that we somehow immediately breathed a sigh of relief. The unknown was over. Now we had to act. Having given orders, Conflot went to the ships. I went up to get some air. After the electric light of the dungeon, the bright sun is blinding. It is already burning, promising a hot day. The sea is quiet, visible to the horizon. Puffing smoke, the tugboat is pulling the barge, heading for Tallinn. The captain and all the crew of the tugboat are hurrying home to their families. They have not yet heard about the war, bombings, fires. But on the ships they already know everything. There are rallies. Sailors swear to fulfill their duty to the end. Many are applying to the party they want to go into battle as communists. All of us will face the most responsible test. Our knowledge, courage, dedication will be severely tested. Flag Navigator Captain 2nd Rank BN. Iosifov searched for me. He reported all beacons are extinguished, floating fencing of the banks and shoals is removed. A new test for commanders and navigators of ships. The sea will now become numb. Its expanses will no longer flash white, red, green lights that speak so much to the sailor. The Chief of Intelligence, our all-time favourite Lieutenant Colonel N.S. Frumkin, arrived. He reported that the fascist radio openly announced that the sea between the island of Eland and the port of Memel had been mined. Captain Lieutenant Lukyanchikov immediately put the data on the map, shook his head. It turns out the entire southern part of the Baltic blocked. It can't be. Another fascist fake. No, objected the head of the operations department, Captain 1st Rank GE, Pilipovsky. It seems to be true. The Germans will do anything to delay the deployment of our submarines in this area. Yes, they did. The Nazis put here 3,300 mines and mine guards, and yet they could not prevent the deployment of Soviet submarines. Reports, inquiries, requests. We urgently need auxiliary vessels, tugs, barges, tankers. I order the head of the military communications department, Captain 2nd Rank Ivan Nikolaevich Gontsov, to contact the Baltic Shipping Company, commercial ports. But they don't understand anything there. Mobilization hasn't been announced yet. In civilian organizations they are still living yesterday. The director of the theatre calls invites sailors to a new performance. The sponsored school asks to allocate counselors to the pioneer camp, arrived students of civilian universities for internship. The head of the internship is worried about their accommodation. Soviet people yesterday did not think about the war, although they sang that our armoured train stands on the reserve track, but it was not so easy for this armoured train to pick up steam. At the command centre arrive for instructions commanders of formations and ships. Squadron Commander Rear Admiral D.D. Vdovichenko gazes intently into the map of the situation. He is calm and composed. Silently reviewed the documents that handed him one of the operators, approached me. Everything is clear to me. Permission to execute? We shook hands. and he hurried to his ships. The same strict and a little verbal behavior of the commander of the minesweeper OK Captain First Rank NI. Meshchersky and the commander of the protection of the water area of the main base Captain Second Rank AA. Myleshkin. They learn their tasks at once and do not linger at the command post. Called the Chief of Staff Aviation Colonel D.I. Sukov. Airplanes flew on reconnaissance in the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic Sea. Report after report, submarines go to the positions, bomber aviation flies out for retaliatory strikes on Nazi naval bases and for mine laying. The duty operators of the headquarters posts are changed, but they do not go to rest. After drinking a glass of strong tea, they return to help their comrades. After all, we have 10 times more work than before. The commander of the fleet appears at the BFCP for a short time, listens to my report, gives instructions and leaves for a meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the Council of People's Commissars of Estonia. At noon, the whole country learns about the war. Now we quickly find common ground with local organizations. The merchant and fishing fleets allocate us more than 200 different ships together with their crews. Thousands of fighters and commanders called up from the reserves are arriving. We are more and more convinced the whole nation is joining the fight. This immediately adds strength. From Moscow received an order to immediately begin setting defensive mine barriers on the plan to cover. At night, the squadron commander Vitovichenko took to the sea his ships loaded with mines. They put a barrier at the mouth of the Gulf of Finland. More than 3,500 mines blocked the way to the enemy. 20 submarines took positions. On June 24th, the fleet aviation struck the Nazi naval base Memel on airfields. Judging by control aerial photos, the enemy suffered great damage. We are closely following the actions of our submariners, but we rarely receive messages from them, and there is little consolation in them. There are no combat results. We began to blame the commanders for ineptitude and indecision. But it turned out to be something else. The Nazis foresaw the deployment of our boats, so the urgent cargoes began to be transported on small, shallow-sitting ships, letting them in shallow water, where our submariners could not get through. And large German transports went skerries in Swedish territorial waters, often guarded by patrol boats, on the masts of which the Nazis raised the Swedish flag. Returning from the campaign, the commander of the submarine She 311 Lieutenant Captain Paul Sidorenko said, "So frustrating we see the Nazi transport, but it goes on skerries in Swedish territorial waters, where we have no right to enter." But finally the submariners began to report the first successes. Submarine S-11 under the command of Lieutenant Captain Atea Sereda in the area of Palanga sunk a Nazi ship. She 307 Captain Lieutenant N.I. Petrov sent to the bottom of the Nazi submarine U-144, cruising in our waters in the area of the Moonsund Islands. The first trip of our submarine minesweeper L3 commanded by Captain Second Rank PD. Grishchenko was also successful. On June 27th, the submariners put a mine barrier near Memel. Soon a Nazi ship exploded on these mines and died. A month later, L3 again went to sea, this time in the area of Cape Blusterort, EPD. Grishchenko is a thinking, inquisitive commander. Before laying mines, he conducted a thorough reconnaissance, clarified where exactly and what courses the enemy ships were travelling. 2 days he waited, looked out until he found German minesweepers. I approached them. I made sure that they were going with trawls. So they are clearing the way for some big ships. Having let the minesweepers pass, L3 went to the fairway trawled by them and put mines. 3 hours later a German transport blew up here, and a little later 2 more large ships with troops and armament. Lieutenant Commander D.S. Abrosimov's S-4 also pleased us. She sank the German troop transport Kaya near Klaipeda. Underwater barrier Lembit under the command of Lieutenant Commander V.A. Polschuk put mines near Bornholm Island. The air Nazi ship exploded on them. 2 more ships were lost to the Nazis as a result of torpedo attacks of the submarine Kalev under the command of Lieutenant Commander B.A. Nairov. So already in the first weeks of the war, the loud combat glory of the Baltic submariners began. But on land things were not going well for us. The fascists were pushing the troops covering our seaside direction from the border with superior forces. The fleet had never been assigned the task of land defence of its bases, and now we had to think about it. Called the commander of the Libava naval base, Captain First Rank MS Klevensky. Our troops are retreating to the north. Strong pressure of tanks, continuous air strikes on infantry. Up to Libava on the way out there are no equipped positions. At 8 o'clock the enemy took Palanga. Now he's 30 kilometers from Libava, preparing for defence. Klevensky spoke smoothly, not in a hurry. But his voice trembled slightly. It was felt that he was stunned by this development of events. We were also discouraged. Defence of the base from the land has always been entrusted to land units, and we thought that if it came to this, the army will repel the blow. Fleet commander called me, and the head of the operational department demanded once again to report what is currently in Libava. We listed, in addition to two 130mm stationary batteries covering from the south and north of the approaches to the port, there is a 180mm railroad battery. 6 batteries of the 84th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Division cover the base from the air enemy. From the land direction, Libava is defended by the 67th Rifle Division of the 8th Army under the command of Major General N.A. Didaev. This division is strongly stretched along the coast. Well, how can Klevensky help the division? At his disposal is a half-crew, a machine gun company and cadets of the Naval Air Defence School, reported Pilopovsky. Komflot hesitated. Not much. And what ships were left there? After the departure of the 1st Submarine Brigade, in the base still remained 15 boats, of which 6 are in repair, 5 should go to Ust-Divinsk, and 3 Little and L3 are on patrol duty. I added that the destroyer Lenin was being repaired in the port of Libavska, and no less than 18 transports were standing by. In addition, 6 torpedo boats, 12 small hunter boats, and the minesweeper Fugas are in service. On Lake Derb is based 43rd Marine Air Reconnaissance Squadron Seaplane Squadron MBR-2. I see, said the commander. Check that all the extra ships went to Vindava and Ust-Divinsk. Communication with Libava every now and then interrupted. We had a lot of worries. Battles were going on at sea and over the sea. But my thoughts kept coming back to Libava. Mikhail Sergeyevich Klevensky, I had no doubt, would do his best. Quite recently, he and I had checked the sea defence of the base in the exercise, in dynamics. Everything was fine then. But will there be enough forces and means to resist the enemy now? In the evening, MS Klevensky again broke through to us by VHF. I hear close artillery fire. Our southern battery has long been firing at the enemy. All day we are bombed. Now the 20th raid has begun. 4 of our submarines took positions in the sea, according to the plan of sea defence. The minesweeper Fugas is laying mines. 6 submarines have left for SDVPSK and 8 transports for Ventspils. 10 ships so far left in the base. At this point, the telephone connection with Libava for a long time interrupted. Komflot called Riga and Moscow, trying to find out the situation of the 8th Army, but no clear picture could not be formed. As we learned later, already by the evening of June 22nd, Hitler's troops approached the southern suburbs of Libava. By fire of batteries of the base and heroic resistance of our infantry, the fascists were stopped on a boundary of the river Barta in 15 kilometers from a city. Informed us of this Moscow. Fleet commander first rejoiced and then gloomed. The Nazis bombed the army airfield. Fighter Air Regiment managed to fly from it somewhere. The regiment commander reported the situation in Libava. Is that clear? It's clear, but it means the base was left without fighter cover. And the phones keep ringing and ringing. There are reports of bombing of Riga and Vindava. Finnish airfields hit our base Hanko. Fortunately, no serious damage. And Libava is silent. From different sources we learn that, having failed to break through to the city from the south, the fascists bypassed it and now attack from the east, from the area of Grobini. All at night, Rear Admiral P.A. Train-in called from Riga. Yesterday evening, the 43rd Naval Air Reconnaissance Squadron flew to us on Lake Kish. What's the matter? The commander asked. It turns out that the enemy approached Lake Derb to the east of Libava, where the squadron used to be based, and our seaplanes had to fly to Riga. It became obvious that Libava was surrounded. Soon this was confirmed by MS Klevensky, briefly reporting by radio that the base was already under enemy fire. Parts of the 67th Infantry Division are defending on the outskirts of the city. Through Moscow, it was learned that the troops of the 8th Army, conducting continuous heavy fighting, retreating to Riga. Libava remains in the enemy rear. Commanders of submarines and transports, which arrived to Ust-Dvinsk from Libava, confirmed that the garrison of the encircled base heroically defends, but its forces are melting. By the way, later in the documents captured from the enemy was found a record marked June 25th. Because of stubborn resistance and heavy artillery fire, the offensive of the 291st Infantry Division is suspended. Yes, that was the case. On June 24th, the defenders of Libava infantrymen, sailors, cadets, work units not only stopped, but even counterattacked and somewhat squeezed the Nazis, who had begun to infiltrate into the city. The military council and all of us, officers of the staff, thought about how to help the garrison of Libava. The fleet did not have land forces, send ships to Libava. But all the combat forces of the fleet were busy with mine laying in the Gulf of Finland and the Gulf of Riga, help with aviation. But all our strike aviation at the request of the front was operating near Riga and in the Luga direction. Libava continued to fight. More than once the base tried to bombard the enemy armoured train from the area of the railway station Trobinia. However, it was destroyed by the accurate fire of our naval batteries. From the area of Tosmari factory the enemy was pushed back. But also the brief appearance of enemy soldiers near the military port played a fatal role. The commander of the repairing destroyer Lenin, reasonably fearing as if the fascists had not captured the ship, blew it up. As the senior of the group of repaired ships, he for the same reason ordered to blow up, and 5 submarines that were in the dock. After that, there were more explosions. The mine storehouse of the base was being destroyed. The commander of the frontier ships detachment and the commander of the raid guard, seeing the destruction of the base, left with their boats to Vindava. As a result, only transports and 5 torpedo boats remained in Libava. The 180mm 4-gun battery, no, 18, the pride of our railway artillery, was in a difficult situation. The enemy surrounded it from all sides. The battery commander Captain V.P. Lisetsky acted decisively and boldly. Under the very nose of the enemy, heavy transporters rushed forward. While the enemy recollected, the battery broke out of the ring. On the way the battery was ambushed many times, fought hand-to-hand battles, repaired the railroad track. Every now and then, coming under fire, they advanced through the area occupied by the enemy. The battery was saved. It broke through to Riga, and then, together with the units of our army, withdrew to the east. The garrison that fought suffered a great loss. The division commander, Major General N.A. Didayev, died. The defense of the city was headed by MS Klevensky. All night we tried to clarify the situation at Libava. Chief of Fleet Communications, Colonel Mazernov, usually calm, imperturbable, nervous, every minute wipes sweaty forehead with a handkerchief. He gets the most. Suddenly I see him running with a sheet in his hand. In a hurry, almost knocked me down. We flew into the commander's office together. Tributes ran his eyes over the telegram. It's not getting any easier by the hour. Immediately took up the telephone receiver, direct connection with the Fleet Aviation Commander, and said briefly, "Now come to the control room." The telegram was from Riga. Train-in reported that from Klevensky, received a report 14 kilometers north of Pavilosti, the enemy landed a landing force. Extremely necessary assistance to our aviation. There was no time for clarification and clarification. We had to act. 28 of our SB airplanes took to the air. But no landing in the harbour Pavilosti did not appear. Apparently, someone misled Klevensky. We received an order from the People's Commissar of the Navy Libava should not be surrendered in any case. The garrison of the city fought fiercely. Soldiers and sailors, workers, party and Soviet workers, Komsomol activists, everyone who cared about the Soviet power, went to the firing lines and repulsed frantic attacks of fascists. On the roads leading to Libava, dust clouds were rising. German motorcyclists were rushing forward, counting on a close victory. They saw the suburbs of Libar and anticipated a pleasant vacation. But they were met by friendly fire of Soviet patriots and were drawn into heavy, bloody battles. At the place of Rutsava, the Hitlerites were met by the fighting Komsomol detachment, which was commanded by the secretary of the district committee of LKSM of Latvia, Imants Sudmolis. Together with army men and sailors, Komsomol members repulsed countless enemy attacks. Mortal feats were made in these days by young Latvians. Komsomol member Modris Traimanis crawled with a bunch of grenades to a fascist tank and destroyed it. When fascists landed a parachute landing in the rear of our troops, Komsomol members led by Imants Sudmolis rushed to search for the parachutists. All enemy infiltrators were caught or destroyed. Many time later, after the Nazis broke into the city, they managed to capture the brave Komsomol leader. Sudmolis died of torture, but did not betray his fighting friends who remained in the Libavian underground. After the war, he was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. At one of the sites, a detachment of cadets of the Naval Air Defense School was commanded by Captain V.A. Orlov. A handful of sailors, by fire of machine guns and rifles, grenades and bottles with combustible mixture for several days, repulsed attacks of German infantry and tanks. The sailors let the tanks as close as possible, and then jumped out of trenches and trenches, threw bundles of grenades under the tracks, set fire to the enemy vehicles with a flammable mixture. Many unknown heroes fought at the walls of Libava. Different ways led them to the ranks of the defenders of the city. Petty Officer A. Prostorov served at the Hydro Aerodrome as an aviation mechanic, served airplanes MBR-2. But here Hitlerites approached the Lake d'Urbe, where hydroaviation was based. The airplanes, having dropped their bomb load on the enemy columns for the last time, were forced to fly away to another water body. At the Hydro Aerodrome remained a petty officer, and with him 11 sailors. Prostorov led his small detachment to Libava. Sailors distinguished themselves in fights on June 26th, when Hitlerites were rushing forward with the greatest fierceness. Prostorov threw off his tunic. His mighty figure in a calfskin coat, with a machine gun raised high above his head, was remembered by all. "Sailors, follow me," was heard the commander's voice. And the sailors rushed into the counterattack. Petty officer of the first article Kudyakov, redcoats Markov, Palchenko were not a step behind Prostorov, drawing the rest of the soldiers with their impulse. Women and even children took part in the fights for Libava. Some of them brought ammunition, others helped the wounded, worked in hospitals. On June 27th, fulfilling the order of the Stavka, our troops broke through the enemy ring and left Libava. But the fighting in the city continued in the first days of July. Eyewitnesses told that 5 sailors were fighting in one of the houses. They repulsed Hitlerite attacks for a long time. Fighting to the last opportunity, the sailors died under the debris of the building, blown up by fascists. Already after the war, in these ruins were found the remains of heroes and shreds of old Navy clothes. The communications officer on duty said that I was called Klevensky. I rushed to the phone. In the receiver heard a distant, indistinct voice. A report arrived on easel at the headquarters of General Eliseev. I tell him to immediately send a report by telegraph, because the phone was very bad hearing. An hour later, the report about the last hours of Libava was on my desk. It said that the garrison units, having overturned the enemy barricades, were withdrawing to the north in 2 columns in order to make their way to Vindava and to organize a new line of defense on the Venta River. The wounded, women and children were loaded onto transports. Batteries and other stationary military installations had to be blown up. Not without enemy sorties. Someone's evil hand early set fire to the fuel depot, and burning oil spilled over the surface of the harbour. We had to take the ships out to sea without waiting for the end of loading. The base commander, headquarters and political department were the last to leave Libava. They left on 3 torpedo boats under the command of the detachment Lieutenant Commander S.A. Osipov. At Cape Ujava they were attacked by 6 German torpedo boats. The unequal battle lasted long. One of our boats was lost. Having picked up the survivors from the water, the rest reached their own. The battle was fought near Vindava. Under the onslaught of the superior enemy, our units were forced to withdraw. The enemy was on their heels. On the bank of the western Divina, fierce fights broke out. Not all defenders of Libava managed to escape from the ring. Many remained in the enemy rear, joined the partisans, and in their ranks selflessly fought against the invaders until the liberation of the Baltic by our troops. The fleet lost a major naval base of strategic importance. It was hard to reconcile with this thought. And here came new worries. The Eighth Army, as it turned out, was withdrawing not to Riga, and much further east this was confirmed by reports from Moscow, although very late. I was summoned by the fleet commander. No sooner had I closed the door than the admiral said gloomily, "The People's Commissar called. There is an order to evacuate the Riga base." In the Latvian capital was already raging fires. The streets heard indiscriminate firing when a division of destroyers under the flag of Rear Admiral V.P. Drozd returned to the base after the first mine setting. The rest was forgotten. Sailors' ships were in a hurry to take the mines. Everyone was working: machinists, artillerymen, and signallers. Valentin Petrovich Drozd told me afterwards. "Imagine fires and firing closer and closer to the port. We don't know who is shooting. I don't know why fires are breaking out in the port either. Our military is no longer in the city, nor the police. Some people are spreading rumours that the Germans are about to enter the city. My sailors caught 2 provocateurs at the gates, but who should I hand them over to? No, it's calmer at sea. As soon as the last mine rolled onto the deck, we immediately gave up the moorings. It was immediately easier on the soul. Yes, Hitlerites were at Riga, and in the Gulf of Riga was still our detachment of light forces led by the cruiser Kirov and a large number of ships of the auxiliary fleet. Munson Strait was mined, and the ships were trapped. There is also a shallow Strait Muhuvayan with an old abandoned channel, which the enemy did not give importance to, knowing that the draft of our ships and transports, overloaded with evacuated property, will not allow to pass this way. The fascists trumpeted on the radio that the Russian fleet was blocked and no Soviet ship would escape from the Gulf of Riga. But they triumphed too soon. Sailors of the merchant fleet, with the participation of our hydrographers, working day and night without a break, for several days deepened the channel in the Strait Muhuvayan. On June 30th, the cruiser Kirov and other ships safely left the Gulf of Riga. Attempts of fascist aviation to strike at the departing ships were unsuccessful. When the fascists occupied Riga on July 1st, they found the port empty. The news was heavier one after another. Pskov was abandoned. The battles are already on the territory of the Leningrad region. Enemy troops are coming closer and closer to Tallinn. We have to take measures to strengthen the defense of the main base. We received front reports at night, processed them by morning, put the situation on the map. We used to listen to the report of the operational duty officer on the headquarters, very active Lieutenant Captain Lukyanchikov, and silently follow the tip of his pencil. The front line was getting closer and closer to Leningrad. We were comforted by the famous reasoning of the great naval commander S.O. Makarov: no matter how hard it is for us in battle, we never know exactly how hard it is for the enemy at the same time. And we firmly knew that the Nazis were suffering huge losses.